There are moments in history when the fate of a nation rests not in the hands of its people, but in the quiet rooms where kings and spies exchange promises. In the heart of the 20th century, beneath the shadow of mountains older than memory, a dynasty rose and fell like the arc of a single breath. It wore the crown of Persia. It dreamed of modernization. It danced with foreign powers who whispered of progress, of oil, of alliance. But empires built on sand, no matter how golden, are always at the mercy of the wind. This is the story of the Pahlavi Dynasty, a family that ruled Iran with both vision and violence, whose throne was propped up by American intelligence, and whose collapse would reshape the Middle East forever. Tonight, as the world quiets and your thoughts begin to drift, let us walk together through palaces and protests, through coups and revolutions, through the rise and ruin of a royal dream that still echoes in the silence of today. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle subscribe, a quiet like, they help us continue weaving these stories for you, night after night, when the world asks you to rest but your mind still wanders. We're here for that. Let us be your companion in the dark. In the beginning, there was only dust and disorder. Iran, at the dawn of the 20th century, was a land caught between empires, a nation whose borders were drawn by foreign hands and whose sovereignty existed only in name. The Qajar dynasty, which had ruled Persia for over a century, had grown old and weak, its kings more interested in European luxuries than the welfare of their people. The palace walls were thick with intrigue, but thin against the ambitions of outsiders. Russia pressed from the north. Britain pressed from the south. And between them, Iran trembled, a prize to be divided, a kingdom without the strength to defend itself. The people knew this. In the cities and the villages, in the bustling bazaars of Tehran and the quiet valleys of the Alborz mountains, they felt the weight of occupation, the shame of a nation that could not stand on its own. There were no factories to speak of. The roads were little more than dirt paths worn by centuries of caravans. Education was a privilege for the few. And the army, once the pride of Persian kings, had become a patchwork of tribal militias and foreign-trained units that answered to whichever power paid them most. Into this world, in 1878, a boy was born in the northern village of Alasht. His name was Reza Khan, and he was the son of a soldier. There was nothing remarkable about his birth, nothing that suggested destiny. His family was poor, his future uncertain. But he had something that wealth could not buy and lineage could not grant, a will forged in hardship, and an eye for the shifting tides of power. As a young man, Reza joined the Persian Cossack Brigade, a military unit trained and commanded by Russian officers. It was there, in the discipline of the barracks and the rhythm of drills, that he learned what it meant to lead. He was tall, imposing, with a gaze that did not waver and a voice that demanded obedience. His fellow soldiers respected him. His superiors feared him. And slowly, quietly, he began to rise through the ranks, not through birth or favor, but through sheer force of presence. The world around him was changing. The First World War had torn through the old empires, leaving thrones toppled and borders redrawn. Russia, once a great power, had collapsed into revolution. Britain, exhausted but victorious, tightened its grip on the regions it controlled. And Iran, nominally neutral, had been occupied by both sides, its resources plundered, its people ignored. The Qajar Shah, Ahmad Shah, was young and ineffectual, more interested in European fashions than the crumbling nation he ruled. The government was a revolving door of weak ministers, each more corrupt than the last. Reza Khan watched all of this with the patience of a man who understood timing. He saw the chaos. He saw the opportunity. And in February of 1921, he made his move. With a small force of 3,000 men from the Cossack Brigade, he marched into Tehran. There was no grand battle, no siege. The capital, weary and demoralized, simply opened its gates. The old government fell without a fight, and Reza Khan, the soldier from Alasht, became the power behind the throne. He did not crown himself immediately. That would have been too bold, too sudden. Instead, he positioned himself as the savior of order, the strong hand Iran desperately needed. He took the title of Minister of War, then Prime Minister, consolidating his control piece by piece. The young Shah, Ahmad, watched helplessly as his authority evaporated, until finally, in 1923, he left Iran for Europe, never to return. The throne was empty. The people were waiting. And Reza Khan, with the quiet confidence of inevitability, reached out and took it. In 1925, the Majlis, Iran's parliament, formally deposed the Qajar dynasty and declared Reza Khan the new Shah. He chose a new name for his line, Pahlavi, invoking the ancient Persian language, a symbol of return to greatness. He crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, the first of a new dynasty, and promised to drag Iran, by force if necessary, into the modern age. The ceremony was grand, but the real work had already begun. Iran would no longer be a pawn. It would be a nation reborn. Or so he believed. Reza Shah did not waste time with sentiment. He was not a romantic, not a dreamer who spoke in poetry and waited for the world to bend to his vision. He was a soldier, and soldiers build empires with their hands. From the moment he took the throne, he set about remaking Iran with the relentless efficiency of a man who believed hesitation was weakness. The country he inherited was fractured, tribal, a patchwork of loyalties that answered to local khans and religious leaders more than to any central authority. He would change that. He would forge a nation from the scattered pieces, even if it meant breaking what would not bend. His first task was the army. A nation without a strong military, he believed, was a nation at the mercy of its neighbors. He expanded and modernized the armed forces, importing European officers to train his soldiers, purchasing weapons from abroad, and bringing the tribal militias under central command. The old warlords, who had ruled their territories like petty kings, were stripped of their power. Some submitted. Others resisted, and were crushed. Reza Shah did not negotiate with those who threatened his authority. He simply removed them, quietly and without ceremony. Then came the roads. Iran, vast and mountainous, had never been truly connected. Travel between cities was slow, dangerous, a journey measured in weeks rather than days. Reza Shah ordered the construction of a trans-Iranian railway, a massive project that would link the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, cutting through deserts and tunneling through mountains. It was a feat of engineering that many said was impossible. He did not care. He conscripted labor, diverted funds, pushed the project forward with an iron will. When it was completed in 1938, it was a symbol of the new Iran, modern, unified, unyielding. Education followed. The Shah established schools across the country, secular schools where children learned science and history rather than only religious texts. He founded the University of Tehran, the first modern institution of higher learning in Iran. He wanted a generation of Iranians who could read, who could think, who could compete with the world. The clerics, who had long held a monopoly on education, watched this transformation with growing unease. Their influence was being diluted, their traditional authority challenged by a state that no longer asked for their blessing. And then there was the matter of dress. In 1928, Reza Shah issued a decree that struck at the heart of tradition. Men were required to wear Western-style clothing, and the traditional turban and robes were banned for all but registered clergy. Later, in 1936, he went further, banning the veil for women, a move that shocked the conservative elements of society. His wife and daughters appeared in public unveiled, setting the example. Police were instructed to enforce the law, sometimes forcibly removing veils from women in the streets. It was modernization as mandate, progress imposed from above. To the Shah, it was necessary. To many Iranians, especially in the rural and religious communities, it was an assault on their identity, their faith, their way of life. Reza Shah believed that Iran's backwardness was a matter of mindset, and that mindset could be legislated away. He changed the official calendar from the Islamic to the Persian, anchoring national identity in the pre-Islamic glories of ancient Persia. He renamed the country from Persia to Iran, emphasizing its Aryan heritage. He built factories, expanded industry, encouraged trade. On the surface, Iran was transforming, becoming something it had never been, a centralized, modern state with the infrastructure and institutions of a 20th-century power. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The clerics, sidelined and humiliated, did not forget. The tribal leaders, stripped of their autonomy, nursed their grudges in silence. The common people, forced into unfamiliar clothes and strange new customs, felt the weight of change as an imposition rather than liberation. Reza Shah had built his new Iran with the efficiency of a military campaign, but he had not won the hearts of his people. He had their obedience, enforced by police and law. But obedience born of fear is fragile, and the Shah, for all his strength, had not learned to listen. Still, he pressed on. He believed that time would prove him right, that the next generation would thank him for what he had done. He was building a legacy, a dynasty that would endure. The Pahlavi name would be remembered, he was certain, as the name that saved Iran. But history, as it often does, had other plans. And the very forces that had allowed him to rise, foreign powers, military strength, ruthless pragmatism, would soon become the instruments of his undoing. The world was moving toward war again, and Iran, despite all its modernization, was still a prize coveted by empires. The Shah had built a throne, but he had built it on sand. By the late 1930s, Reza Shah's Iran stood as a testament to what willpower could achieve. The railways cut through the heart of the country like steel veins, carrying goods and people across distances that had once taken months to traverse. The cities hummed with the noise of industry. Schools multiplied. The army, once a ragtag collection of tribal fighters, now marched in disciplined formations, armed with modern weapons and trained in European tactics. Tehran itself had transformed, its streets widened, its architecture reflecting a blend of Persian heritage and Western ambition. The Shah had built his vision, brick by brick, decree by decree. But visions, no matter how grand, cannot exist in isolation. The world beyond Iran's borders was darkening, and the storm that was gathering would not ask permission before it crossed the threshold. In Europe, Adolf Hitler had risen to power, and the Third Reich was expanding its reach with terrifying speed. The Soviet Union, still reeling from its own internal purges, watched warily from the north. Britain, ever protective of its imperial interests, kept a careful eye on the Middle East, where oil had become the lifeblood of modern warfare. And Iran, sitting at the crossroads of these powers, held within its soil one of the world's richest reserves of that black gold. Reza Shah, who had spent 2 decades asserting Iran's independence, now found himself trapped in a game far larger than any he had played before. He had tried to remain neutral. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, Reza Shah declared that Iran would not take sides. He had no love for the British, who had meddled in Iranian affairs for decades, controlling the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and treating Iran as little more than a resource to be exploited. He had no trust in the Soviets, whose revolution had sent tremors of unrest through Iran's northern provinces. And he had no desire to involve his nation in a conflict that seemed, at first, distant and European. But neutrality, he would soon learn, was a luxury afforded only to those with the power to enforce it. The problem was Germany. Reza Shah had maintained economic and cultural ties with the Germans, seeing in them a counterbalance to British and Soviet influence. German engineers had worked on Iranian infrastructure projects. German advisors had consulted on industrial development. There was no formal alliance, no military pact, but the perception alone was enough. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the calculus shifted. Britain and the Soviet Union, now reluctant allies against the Nazi threat, could not afford to let Iran remain a potential backdoor for German influence. They needed the Trans-Iranian Railway to supply Soviet forces. They needed Iran's oil to fuel their war machine. And they needed Reza Shah to comply, or to be removed. In August 1941, they made their move. British and Soviet forces invaded Iran from multiple directions, a coordinated assault that met almost no resistance. The Iranian army, modernized though it was, could not stand against two of the world's great powers. The Shah's commanders, faced with overwhelming force, capitulated within days. The invasion was swift, clinical, and humiliating. Reza Shah, the man who had built his throne on the promise of strength and independence, found himself powerless to defend either. The Allies demanded his abdication. They claimed he was too sympathetic to Germany, too unpredictable, too much of a risk. But the real reason was simpler: they needed a ruler they could control. Reza Shah, proud and stubborn, had never been easy to manipulate. His son, however, was young, untested, and uncertain. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, just 21 years old, had been raised in privilege and educated in Switzerland, far from the harsh realities of Iranian politics. He had not fought for the throne as his father had. He had inherited it, and now, under the most fragile of circumstances, he would inherit it again. On September 16, 1941, Reza Shah abdicated. There was no ceremony, no grand farewell. He was escorted from the palace by British officers, placed on a ship, and sent into exile. First to Mauritius, then to South Africa, far from the country he had remade in his image. He carried with him only a fraction of the wealth he had accumulated, and none of the power. The man who had marched into Tehran with 3,000 soldiers, who had crowned himself Shah and bent an entire nation to his will, left as a prisoner, stripped of everything but his memories. He died in Johannesburg in 1944, a broken man, far from the mountains and deserts of the land he had loved and ruled with equal ferocity. And so the Pahlavi Dynasty, barely 2 decades old, passed to the son. Mohammad Reza Shah ascended the Peacock throne in the shadow of foreign occupation, a young king whose authority was borrowed, whose legitimacy was granted not by the people but by the very powers his father had spent a lifetime resisting. Iran was still nominally independent, but the illusion was thin. British and Soviet forces remained on Iranian soil throughout the war, extracting oil, using the railways, treating the country as their own. The new Shah could do nothing but watch, smile for the cameras, and wait for the occupiers to leave. He was a king without power, a symbol without substance. But he was patient. And in the years that followed, he would learn to play the game his father never mastered, the game of survival through alliance, of power through dependence. The throne was his. But the price of keeping it would be higher than even he could imagine. The storm had passed, but the seeds of another, far more dangerous, had already been planted. The young Shah who sat upon the Peacock throne in 1941 was not the man his father had been. Where Reza Shah had been a force of nature, brutal and unyielding, Mohammad Reza was cautious, polished, a product of European schools and royal expectations. He had been trained to rule, but not to fight for that rule. He spoke French fluently, admired Western culture, and carried himself with the grace of a monarch born to the role. But grace, in the hard world of geopolitics, was not enough. The throne beneath him was unstable, propped up by foreign armies and foreign interests. And though the war would eventually end, the occupation would leave scars that never fully healed. By 1946, the Allies had withdrawn their forces, but the damage was done. Iran had been used, its resources drained, its sovereignty violated. The young Shah struggled to assert his authority over a fractured nation. The parliament, the Majlis, had grown more assertive during the war, emboldened by the Shah's weakness. Political parties multiplied, each with its own vision for Iran's future. The Tudeh party, aligned with the Soviet Union, gained support among workers and intellectuals. Nationalist movements stirred in the provinces. And everywhere, there was the question that would define the next decade: who truly controlled Iran? The answer, for many, was painfully clear. It was not the Shah. It was not the Majlis. It was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the British corporation that had held the concession to Iran's oil since 1909. The terms of that concession were a national humiliation. Iran received only a small fraction of the profits from its own oil, while Britain reaped enormous wealth. The oil fields of Kazakhstan, in the southwest, pumped black gold that fueled the British Navy, powered British industry, and enriched British shareholders. Iranian workers labored in dangerous conditions for meager wages, living in squalid company towns while British executives enjoyed luxury in their gated compounds. It was colonialism without the honesty of direct rule, exploitation dressed in the language of legal contracts. The resentment was not new. For decades, Iranians had chafed under this arrangement, but they had lacked the political unity to challenge it. Reza Shah had tried to renegotiate the terms in the 1930s, demanding a greater share of the profits, and he had succeeded to a degree. But the fundamental inequality remained. The oil was Iranian, but the control was British. And as the post-war world began to stir with movements of decolonization and national sovereignty, that contradiction became unbearable. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped a man who would become both hero and cautionary tale. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh, and he was not a revolutionary in the traditional sense. He was a statesman, an aristocrat, a man educated in European law who had served in the Majlis for years. He was frail, often ill, prone to theatrical displays of emotion that his enemies mocked and his supporters adored. But beneath the theatrics was a core of unyielding principle. Mossadegh believed, with a fervor that bordered on obsession, that Iran's oil belonged to Iran. Not to Britain. Not to any foreign company. To the people whose land held it, whose labor extracted it, whose future depended on it. He was not alone in this belief. By the late 1940s, a growing chorus of voices in the Majlis and the streets demanded nationalization. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, they argued, was a parasite, draining the nation's wealth while giving nothing back. The British, sensing the shift, attempted to negotiate, offering slightly better terms, a few more percentage points of profit. But it was too little, too late. The demand was no longer for better terms. It was for total control. In 1951, the Majlis passed a bill to nationalize the oil industry. It was a historic moment, a declaration of economic independence that sent shockwaves through the capitals of the West. And Mohammad Mossadegh, the architect of this bold move, was appointed Prime Minister by a near-unanimous vote. The young Shah, unable to resist the popular tide, reluctantly signed the decree. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was dissolved. Its assets were seized. And for the first time in decades, Iranians dared to believe that their country might truly belong to them. But empires do not surrender their prizes easily. In London, the reaction was swift and furious. The British government, under Prime Minister Clement Attlee and later Winston Churchill, condemned the nationalization as theft. They imposed sanctions, froze Iranian assets, and organized a boycott of Iranian oil. British tankers refused to transport it. Foreign companies refused to buy it. The Iranian economy, heavily dependent on oil revenue, began to falter. Mossadegh, defiant, held firm. He toured the country, rallying support, appearing before crowds with tears streaming down his face as he spoke of dignity and sovereignty. The people loved him. But love, in the cold calculus of geopolitics, was not enough. The British considered military intervention, but they were war-weary and overstretched. Instead, they turned to their American allies, who had their own reasons to be concerned. The Cold War was in full swing, and the United States feared that instability in Iran would create an opening for Soviet influence. The Tudeh Party, with its ties to Moscow, was growing stronger. The Americans did not care about Britain's lost profits. But they cared very much about losing Iran to communism. And so, in the shadowed corridors of power, a different kind of intervention began to take shape. Not invasion. Not diplomacy. Something quieter, more insidious. A plan that would change the course of Iranian history and haunt the conscience of American foreign policy for generations. The stage was set. The actors were in place. And the coup was coming. The men who plotted the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh did not do so in the light of day. They worked in secret, in the offices of intelligence agencies, in coded cables sent between Washington and London, in quiet meetings where maps were spread across polished tables and futures were decided with the stroke of a pen. The operation had a name, cold and clinical, Ajax. It was the brainchild of British intelligence, MI6, refined and executed by the American CIA. And at its heart was a simple, brutal logic: democracy, if it threatened Western interests, could not be allowed to stand. The Americans were reluctant at first. President Harry Truman had little appetite for overthrowing a democratically elected leader, especially one who was not a communist. But Truman left office in January 1953, and his successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, saw the world through a different lens. Eisenhower, the former general, the man who had led Allied forces to victory in Europe, understood power and the necessity of strategic dominance. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and his CIA Director, Allen Dulles, were both convinced that Iran was on the brink of falling to the Soviets. Mossadegh, they argued, was naive, unstable, unable to control the communist elements within his coalition. If he remained in power, Iran would become another Soviet satellite, and the entire Middle East would be at risk. It was not entirely true, but it did not need to be. The narrative was enough. And so, in the spring of 1953, the CIA gave the green light. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt and a senior officer in the CIA's Middle East Division, was dispatched to Tehran to oversee the operation. He arrived quietly, carrying with him a briefcase full of money and a plan to destabilize a government from within. The strategy was elegant in its cruelty. Roosevelt and his team would not invade. They would not assassinate. They would instead create chaos, turn the people against Mossadegh, and make his removal seem inevitable, even necessary. They recruited agents within the Iranian military, paying off officers who harbored resentment toward the Prime Minister. They bribed members of the Majlis, journalists, and street organizers. They spread propaganda, printing leaflets and newspapers that painted Mossadegh as a danger to Islam, a threat to the monarchy, a puppet of the communists. None of it was true, but truth, in the machinery of a coup, is expendable. They also exploited the growing tension between Mossadegh and the Shah. Mohammad Reza had never been comfortable with the Prime Minister's popularity. He resented the way Mossadegh commanded the Majlis, the way crowds chanted his name, the way he seemed to eclipse the throne itself. The Shah was young, insecure, desperate to prove himself as more than a symbolic figurehead. The CIA saw this weakness and used it. They convinced the Shah that Mossadegh was undermining the monarchy, that his continued power would lead to the abolition of the throne altogether. The Shah, fearful and uncertain, agreed to sign royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing a new prime minister loyal to the palace. But Mossadegh did not go quietly. When the decrees were delivered, he refused to accept them, arguing that the Shah had overstepped his constitutional authority. His supporters took to the streets in protest, and for a moment, it seemed the coup might fail. The Shah, panicking, fled the country with his wife, first to Baghdad, then to Rome. He waited in exile, uncertain whether he would ever return. Meanwhile, in Tehran, chaos erupted. Roosevelt, undeterred, moved to the next phase. On August 19, 1953, his agents orchestrated mass demonstrations, flooding the streets with paid protesters. Some chanted in favor of the Shah. Others, disguised as communists, rioted and vandalized, creating the illusion of lawlessness and threatening instability. The military officers who had been bought off moved into position. Tanks rolled through Tehran. Mossadegh, watching from his residence, realized too late what was happening. By midday, pro-Shah forces had seized key government buildings. By evening, Mossadegh was under arrest, his government dissolved, his dream shattered. The young Shah returned to Iran in triumph, flown back on an American plane, greeted by crowds that had been assembled and paid to cheer. He wept openly, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. The monarchy had been saved. His throne was secure. And he owed it all to the Americans, a debt that would shape the rest of his reign. Mossadegh was tried for treason and sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by house arrest for the remainder of his life. He lived quietly in his village, a broken man, watching from the shadows as the nation he had tried to liberate slipped back into the hands of foreign powers. The oil, of course, returned to foreign control, though the terms were adjusted. A new consortium was formed, splitting the profits among British, American, Dutch, and French companies. Iran received more than it had before, but the principle had been lost. The dream of true independence, of sovereignty over one's own resources, had been crushed. And the method of its crushing, the quiet coup, the bought riots, the manipulation of fear, would become a template for American intervention in the decades to come. But there was a cost, one that would not be fully understood for years. The Iranian people had seen their democracy destroyed by foreign powers. They had watched their elected leader overthrown, not by the will of the people but by the machinations of intelligence agencies. That wound would fester, deep and silent, poisoning the relationship between Iran and the West. Trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. And though the Shah ruled for another quarter century, his throne rested on a foundation of betrayal. The people had not forgotten. They would never forget. And when the reckoning finally came, it would sweep away not just the Shah, but the entire illusion of progress he represented. The coup had succeeded. But the consequences were only beginning. In the aftermath of the coup, Iran settled into an uneasy calm. The streets of Tehran, which had roared with protest and demonstration, grew quiet again. The Shah, restored to his throne by American hands, set about consolidating the power he had nearly lost. He had learned a lesson in those terrifying days of exile, waiting in Rome to see if he would ever return. He had learned that popularity was fickle, that democracy could be dangerous, and that survival required not the love of the people but the loyalty of the army and the blessing of foreign allies. He would not make the mistake of weakness again. Mohammad Reza Shah emerged from the crisis a changed man. The uncertainty that had defined his early reign hardened into resolve. He became more authoritarian, more willing to use force, more convinced that he alone understood what Iran needed. And what Iran needed, he believed, was modernization at any cost, stability enforced by strength, and alignment with the West, particularly the United States. The Americans, after all, had saved him. They had shown him what power looked like when wielded with precision. And he intended to wield it himself. The oil wealth, now flowing more freely under the new consortium arrangement, gave the Shah the resources to pursue his vision. Revenue poured into the treasury, and he directed it toward grand projects that echoed his father's ambitions but with a grander, more lavish scale. Dams were built. Highways stretched across the desert. Factories rose in industrial zones. The military expanded, equipped with the latest American weapons, jets, helicopters, tanks, turning Iran into what the Shah proudly called the policeman of the Persian Gulf. He wanted Iran to be respected, feared even, a regional power that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the great nations of the world. But beneath the surface of this modernization, something darker was taking shape. The Shah had not forgotten the fragility of his position, the ease with which a government could be toppled, a leader overthrown. He became obsessed with control, with eliminating any threat before it could grow. Political parties were restricted. Dissent was monitored. The press, once vibrant and argumentative, was brought to heel. Journalists who criticized the regime found their newspapers shut down, their careers ended. Intellectuals who questioned the direction of the country were watched, harassed, sometimes arrested. The Shah was building a modern Iran, yes, but he was also building a cage. And to enforce that cage, he needed an instrument of fear. In 1957, with the help of American and Israeli intelligence services, the Shah established SAVAK, the Organization of National Security and Intelligence. On paper, it was a domestic intelligence agency, tasked with protecting national security. In practice, it became one of the most feared secret police forces in the world. SAVAK's agents were everywhere, listening, watching, infiltrating. They operated with impunity, answerable only to the Shah himself. Their methods were brutal: torture, imprisonment without trial, disappearances in the dead of night. Families woke to find their sons or daughters gone, taken in unmarked cars, held in secret prisons where screams went unheard. The training for SAVAK came from the CIA and Mossad, who taught interrogation techniques, surveillance methods, and the art of breaking the human spirit without leaving too many visible scars. The Americans justified their involvement by framing it as a bulwark against communism. The Tudeh party still existed, underground and dangerous, and preventing Soviet influence in Iran was a strategic priority. But SAVAK's reach extended far beyond communists. Writers, poets, students, union organizers, anyone who dreamed of a different Iran, they all became targets. The Shah's paranoia knew no limits, and SAVAK grew into a vast apparatus of repression, its tentacles reaching into every corner of Iranian society. Yet for all the fear, there was also genuine progress. The oil money funded scholarships that sent thousands of young Iranians to study abroad, in Europe and America, where they absorbed new ideas and returned home hungry for change. Literacy rates climbed. Universities expanded. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers, some rising to positions of influence unthinkable in earlier generations. Tehran transformed into a cosmopolitan city, its boulevards lined with cafes and cinemas, its skyline dotted with modern architecture. For the urban elite, for those who benefited from the Shah's reforms, life was good. Iran felt like it was on the cusp of something great, a nation emerging from centuries of stagnation into the bright light of the 20th century. But that light did not reach everywhere. In the villages, in the rural heartland where most Iranians still lived, the changes felt distant, irrelevant, sometimes hostile. The land reforms that the Shah would later champion disrupted traditional patterns of life without offering meaningful alternatives. Farmers were promised ownership of the land they worked, but the bureaucracy was tangled, the redistribution incomplete. Many ended up worse off than before, drifting to the cities in search of work, swelling the slums that ringed Tehran and other urban centers. The gap between rich and poor widened. The gap between the westernized elite and the traditional masses grew into a chasm. And in the mosques, in the religious schools and the bazaars, a different kind of discontent was brewing. The clerics had watched the Shah's father strip away their influence, and now the son was continuing the work. Religion was being pushed to the margins, treated as a relic of the past, something to be managed rather than respected. The Shah celebrated Iran's pre-Islamic heritage, glorifying the ancient Persian kings while downplaying the role of Islam in shaping the nation's identity. He imported Western culture, encouraged Western dress, promoted a vision of Iran that looked to Paris and New York rather than Mecca. To the religious establishment, this was not progress. It was betrayal. It was the erasure of the soul of Iran in the name of a modernity that served only the elite and their foreign patrons. The clerics did not have the power to challenge the Shah directly. Not yet. But they had something more enduring: they had the ear of the people, the trust of the faithful, the authority of tradition. And they were patient. They watched, and they waited, and they remembered. The Shah, confident in his army and his alliances, did not see the danger. He believed that oil and weapons and Western support had made him invincible. But empires built on fear and dependence are never as strong as they appear. And the cracks, invisible to those at the top, were already beginning to spread. There are moments in history when a single event tilts the axis of a nation, when the choices made in secret rooms by men in suits echo across generations, shaping destinies they will never witness. The summer of 1953 was such a moment for Iran. It was a season of heat and dust, of crowded streets and whispered plans, of a democracy strangled in its infancy and a monarchy resurrected by foreign hands. And at the center of it all was a man who believed, perhaps too deeply, that nations had the right to control their own fate. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh, and though he would be defeated, his ghost would haunt Iran for decades to come. Mossadegh was not a man easily categorized. He was 70 years old when he became Prime Minister in 1951, an aristocrat by birth, a lawyer by training, a nationalist by conviction. He had studied in Europe, earned a doctorate in law from Switzerland, and returned to Iran with ideas about democracy and sovereignty that were radical for his time. He had served in various government positions under the Qajar dynasty and the early Pahlavi years, always with a reputation for integrity, for stubbornness, for refusing to bend to pressure. He was theatrical, prone to weeping in public, to delivering speeches from his bed when illness confined him, to gestures that his enemies mocked as manipulation but his supporters saw as genuine passion. He loved Iran with a fervor that bordered on the spiritual, and he could not bear to see it exploited. The issue that brought him to power was oil, that black liquid treasure that had become both blessing and curse for Iran. Since 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later renamed Anglo-Iranian, had held the exclusive concession to extract and sell Iranian oil. The terms of the agreement were grotesquely unfair. The British company paid Iran a pittance while reaping enormous profits, billions of pounds that flowed to London while Iranian workers labored in dangerous conditions for starvation wages. The company operated as a state within a state, its compounds guarded, its books closed to Iranian inspection, its executives living in luxury while the host nation languished in poverty. It was colonialism in corporate form, and by the late 1940s, the anger over this arrangement had reached a boiling point. Mossadegh had long argued for nationalization, for taking back control of Iran's most valuable resource. He was not alone. A growing movement in the Majlis, the National Front coalition, echoed his demands. The people, too, were ready. In the streets, in the bazaars, in the universities, there was a rising chorus: the oil belongs to Iran. Not to Britain. Not to foreigners. To us. When the Majlis debated the nationalization bill in early 1951, the atmosphere was electric. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, to call for an end to decades of humiliation. And when the vote came, it was overwhelming. The oil industry would be nationalized. The company's assets would be seized. Iran would finally control its own wealth. The young Shah, Mohammad Reza, watched this unfold with deep unease. He had signed the nationalization decree, but only because he had no choice. The public pressure was too great, and refusing would have made him appear as a puppet of the British. But he did not trust Mossadegh. He resented the Prime Minister's popularity, the way crowds gathered to hear him speak, the way his name was chanted with a reverence that should have been reserved for the throne. The Shah was constitutionally the monarch, but Mossadegh wielded the real power, and that imbalance gnawed at him. He was young, insecure, overshadowed by a man old enough to be his grandfather. And he waited for an opportunity to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. The British, meanwhile, were apoplectic. The nationalization was, in their eyes, nothing less than theft. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was one of Britain's most valuable assets, a cornerstone of its economy and its naval power. Losing it was unthinkable. The British government, under Prime Minister Clement Attlee and later Winston Churchill, moved swiftly to punish Iran. They froze Iranian assets held in British banks. They organized an international boycott of Iranian oil, pressuring tanker companies and refineries to refuse Iranian business. They dispatched warships to the Persian Gulf in a show of force. And they began plotting, quietly and seriously, how to remove Mossadegh from power. Mossadegh, for his part, refused to back down. He knew the economic pressure would be severe, but he believed Iran could endure. He toured the country, speaking to massive crowds, his voice trembling with emotion as he explained what was at stake. This was not just about money, he told them. It was about dignity. It was about the right of a nation to stand on its own, to not be a servant to foreign masters. The people rallied to him. They tightened their belts, accepted the hardships, believed in the righteousness of the cause. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though a small nation might stand up to an empire and win. But the British had other plans. They approached the Americans, urging them to intervene. At first, the Truman administration was hesitant. Truman had little sympathy for British imperial interests, and he was wary of overthrowing a democratic government. But when Dwight Eisenhower took office in January 1953, the tone shifted. Eisenhower and his advisors saw the world through the lens of the Cold War, a binary struggle between freedom and communism. And in that framework, Mossadegh was a liability. He was not a communist, but his coalition included the Tudeh Party, which had ties to Moscow. If Iran descended into chaos, the Americans feared, the Soviets might move in. Better to remove Mossadegh now, they reasoned, and install a stable, pro-Western government under the Shah's control. And so, in the shadows, the plan took shape. It would be called Operation Ajax. And it would change everything. The architecture of a coup is built on lies. Not grand, sweeping falsehoods, but small, careful deceptions, layered one atop another until reality itself becomes unstable. Operation Ajax was a masterclass in this dark art. It did not require armies or tanks rolling across borders. It required only money, patience, and a willingness to manipulate the fears and ambitions of ordinary people. The CIA, working in tandem with British intelligence, understood that the best way to topple a government was to make it appear as though the government had toppled itself. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. arrived in Tehran in the summer of 1953, traveling under a false identity, carrying instructions from Washington and a budget of $1 million. He was a quiet man, well-spoken, the kind who could blend into a room and be forgotten. But he had a gift for intrigue, for reading people, for knowing which levers to pull and which strings to tug. He set up operations in a safe house, meeting with contacts, distributing cash, weaving a network of agents and collaborators who would do the work of destabilization from within. The first step was to turn the military. Mossadegh, for all his popularity, did not have the unwavering loyalty of the armed forces. Many officers resented him, viewing him as a civilian who did not understand military matters, a populist who pandered to the masses rather than respecting the hierarchy of power. Roosevelt identified these officers, the ones who were ambitious, who were loyal to the Shah, who could be bought or persuaded. He met them in secret, offered them money, promised them positions of power once Mossadegh was gone. Some accepted out of greed. Others out of genuine belief that the Prime Minister was leading Iran toward chaos. The reasons mattered less than the result. One by one, key military commanders agreed to support the coup. Next came the propaganda. Roosevelt's team flooded Tehran with forged documents, fake newspapers, and planted stories. Some portrayed Mossadegh as a communist sympathizer, a man who would hand Iran over to the Soviet Union. Others painted him as a threat to Islam, a secular autocrat who disrespected the clergy and the traditions of the faith. Neither characterization was true, but truth was irrelevant. The goal was to erode confidence, to sow doubt, to make people question whether Mossadegh was the hero they believed him to be. The propaganda worked on multiple fronts, targeting different audiences with different fears, creating a climate of suspicion and uncertainty. Roosevelt also recruited street organizers, men who could mobilize crowds on command. Some were genuine political activists, members of fringe parties willing to take CIA money to fund their operations. Others were simply thugs, hired muscle who would riot or march or chant slogans for the right price. The plan was to create chaos, to make it seem as though the country was spiraling out of control, and then to present the Shah as the solution, the strong hand needed to restore order. But the coup nearly failed before it began. On August 15, 1953, the Shah, following the script provided by the CIA, signed two royal decrees. One dismissed Mossadegh as prime minister. The other appointed General Fazlallah Zahidi, a military officer loyal to the palace, as his replacement. A colonel was dispatched to deliver the decrees to Mossadegh's residence in the middle of the night. But Mossadegh had been warned. His intelligence network, though not as sophisticated as SAVAK would later become, had picked up whispers of the plot. When the colonel arrived, Mossadegh refused to accept the decrees and had the man arrested. News of the failed attempt spread quickly. Mossadegh's supporters took to the streets in celebration, convinced they had thwarted a royalist coup. The Shah, panicking, fled the country with his wife, first to Baghdad, then to Rome, certain that his reign was over. In Tehran, the mood was jubilant. Statues of the Shah's father, Reza Shah, were torn down. Crowds chanted against the monarchy. For a moment, it seemed as though the democratic forces had won, that the people had defended their prime minister against the machinations of the palace and its foreign backers. But Kermit Roosevelt did not give up. He regrouped, adjusted the plan, and prepared for a second attempt. On August 19, he set the final phase in motion. His agents organized two sets of demonstrations. The first group, posing as Tudeh communists, marched through the streets shouting pro-Soviet slogans, vandalizing shops, attacking symbols of religion and tradition. The goal was to terrify the middle class, the merchants, the religious establishment, to make them believe that Mossadegh's government was incapable of controlling communist radicals. It worked. Fear rippled through the city. Then came the second wave, the pro-Shah demonstrators, organized and paid by Roosevelt's network. They flooded the streets in even greater numbers, chanting for the return of the monarchy, calling for order and stability. The military officers who had been bought off moved into position. Tanks rolled toward key government buildings. By midday, pro-Shah forces had seized the radio station, the telegraph office, and the Prime Minister's residence. Mossadegh, realizing the coup was succeeding, fled over the back wall of his compound and went into hiding. By evening, it was over. General Zahedi appeared on state radio, announcing that he was now Prime Minister by order of the Shah. The monarchy had been restored. Order, he declared, would be re-established. Mossadegh was captured 3 days later, hiding in a friend's house, and placed under arrest. The dream of nationalization, of Iranian sovereignty over its own resources, was crushed. And the young Shah, who had fled in terror just days before, returned to Tehran on an American military plane, welcomed by crowds that had been assembled and paid to cheer for him. He wept as he descended the stairs of the aircraft, overcome with relief and gratitude. He owed his throne to the Americans, and he knew it. That debt would shape every decision he made for the next quarter century. He would align himself completely with Washington, purchasing American weapons, adopting American advisors, building his vision of a modern Iran on a foundation of dependence. And the United States, having demonstrated its willingness and ability to overthrow a democratic government, would use the same playbook again and again, in Guatemala, in Chile, in countless other nations where leaders dared to challenge American interests. But the people of Iran did not forget. They remembered Mossadegh, the old man who had stood up to empires and been destroyed for it. They remembered the coup, the foreign interference, the betrayal. And that memory, buried deep in the national consciousness, would fester and grow, feeding a resentment that no amount of oil wealth or military power could suppress. The Shah had won. But he had won a hollow victory, built on the ruins of trust. And when the reckoning came, it would be absolute. The trial of Mohammad Mossadegh was a spectacle designed to humiliate, to break not just the man but the very idea he represented. He was charged with treason, with attempting to overthrow the constitutional order, accusations dripping with irony given that it was a foreign-backed coup that had removed him from power. The proceedings were held in a military court, not a civilian one, ensuring that the outcome was never in doubt. Mossadegh, frail and defiant, defended himself with the same passion that had once filled stadiums. He spoke of sovereignty, of the right of nations to control their own resources, of the injustice of foreign domination. His words were eloquent, moving, and utterly feudal. The judges had their orders. The verdict was predetermined. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by house arrest for the remainder of his life. He would never again address a crowd, never again hold office, never again threaten the established order. He was sent to a military prison, where he served his sentence in isolation, cut off from the outside world. When he was finally released, he returned to his family estate in the village of Ahmedabad, a few hours from Tehran, and there he remained, a ghost of the political giant he had once been. He tended his garden, read books, received the occasional visitor who braved SAVAK's watchful eye. He lived quietly, his health deteriorating, his spirit unbroken but his influence extinguished. He died in 1967, at the age of 84, mourned by those who remembered what he had fought for, forgotten by a generation raised under the Shah's relentless modernization. But while Mossadegh faded into obscurity, the consequences of his overthrow reverberated through every layer of Iranian society. The nationalization of oil was reversed, but not entirely. The Shah, eager to avoid another popular uprising, ensured that the new arrangement gave Iran a larger share of the profits than the old Anglo-Iranian concession had allowed. A consortium was formed, splitting control among British, American, Dutch, and French companies. Iran received 40% of the revenue, a significant increase, but the principle had been lost. The oil was no longer truly Iranian. It was managed by foreigners, extracted by foreign expertise, sold on terms dictated by foreign interests. The economic benefits were real, but the symbolic wound ran deep. The coup also transformed the Shah's understanding of power. Before 1953, Mohammad Reza had been uncertain, hesitant, a monarch who ruled in the shadow of his father and the constraints of constitutional democracy. After the coup, he became something else, a king who believed his throne was divinely ordained, protected by the United States, untouchable by ordinary political forces. He had seen democracy nearly destroy him, and he vowed never to let it threaten his rule again. The Majlis, once a genuine forum for debate, was neutered, its members vetted, its independence curtailed. Political parties that opposed the Shah were banned or marginalized. Elections became formalities, their outcomes determined before the first vote was cast. And the Americans, having successfully orchestrated the coup, deepened their involvement in Iranian affairs. Iran became a critical ally in the Cold War, a bulwark against Soviet expansion in the Middle East. American military advisors flooded into the country, training the Iranian armed forces, selling billions of dollars worth of weapons. The CIA maintained a strong presence, working closely with SAVAK, sharing intelligence, teaching interrogation techniques. The relationship was not one of equals. It was patron and client, protector and dependent. The Shah understood this, and he accepted it, because the alternative, standing alone, without American support, was a risk he would not take. Yet beneath the surface of this alliance, resentment simmered. The coup had been a public secret, whispered about in bazaars and universities, discussed in coded language by those who dared to question the official narrative. People knew, or suspected, that their prime minister had been removed by foreign powers, that their democracy had been sacrificed to preserve Western access to oil. The narrative that the CIA and the Shah promoted, that Mossadegh had been a dangerous radical leading Iran toward chaos, never fully took hold. Too many remembered the old man's speeches, his tears, his unwavering insistence that Iran deserved to be free. And they remembered who had stood beside him, and who had betrayed him. The clerics, too, drew lessons from Mossadegh's fall. They had not been active participants in the nationalization movement, viewing it as a secular, political affair rather than a religious one. But they had watched carefully. They had seen how foreign powers could manipulate events, how easily a popular leader could be toppled if he lacked the institutional support to defend himself. And they began to understand that if they wanted to challenge the Shah, they would need more than rhetoric. They would need organization, discipline, and the ability to mobilize the masses in ways that transcended political parties and parliamentary debates. Those lessons would take years to bear fruit, but the seeds were planted in the wreckage of 1953. For the Shah, the immediate aftermath of the coup was a period of consolidation and ambition. The oil revenues began to flow more generously, filling state coffers and funding his grand visions. He poured money into the military, into infrastructure, into education. He wanted Iran to be modern, powerful, respected on the world stage. And for a time, it seemed as though he might succeed. The cities grew. The economy expanded. A new middle class emerged, educated, affluent, aligned with the Shah's vision of a westernized Iran. To foreign observers, especially in Washington and London, Iran looked like a success story, proof that modernization and autocracy could coexist, that development did not require democracy. But success, when built on the suppression of dissent and the denial of self-determination, is always fragile. The Shah had won the Battle of 1953, but he had not won the hearts of his people. He had their obedience, enforced by SAVAK's omnipresent surveillance and the threat of imprisonment. He had their labor, their taxes, their outward compliance. But he did not have their trust, and he did not have their love. And as the years passed, as the wealth accumulated and the inequalities widened, as the promises of progress rang hollow for those left behind, the distance between the Shah and his people grew into an unbridgeable chasm. The coup had saved his throne. But it had also sealed his fate. The clock was ticking, slowly and inexorably, toward a reckoning that no amount of oil money or American support could prevent. By the early 1960s, Mohammad Reza Shah had shed the last vestiges of uncertainty that had marked his early reign. He was no longer the hesitant young king who had fled to Rome in fear, waiting for foreign powers to restore him. He was now the Shahanshah, the King of Kings, a title that reached back to the ancient Persian emperors and forward to a future he believed he was destined to create. He stood before his nation with the confidence of a man who had survived assassination attempts, political upheaval, and the constant pressure of Cold War geopolitics. And he was ready to transform Iran, not gradually, not through negotiation, but through a sweeping program of reform that he would call the White Revolution. The name itself was deliberate, a calculated contrast to the Red Revolution of the Communists and the promise of bloodshed that came with it. The Shah's revolution, he declared, would be peaceful, a transformation achieved through law and policy rather than violence and chaos. It would modernize Iran's economy, empower its people, and propel the nation into the ranks of the world's great powers. On January 26, 1963, he put the program to a national referendum. 6 principles were presented to the people: land reform, nationalization of forests, privatization of state-owned enterprises, profit sharing for workers, voting rights for women, and the establishment of a literacy corps to educate rural populations. The referendum passed with overwhelming support. Officially, more than 99% of voters approved. The numbers were almost certainly inflated, the process tightly controlled, but the message was clear. The Shah had a mandate, or at least the appearance of one, and he intended to use it. The most ambitious element of the White Revolution was land reform. For centuries, Iran's agricultural economy had been dominated by large landowners, wealthy families who controlled vast estates while peasant farmers worked the land as sharecroppers, barely surviving on what little they were allowed to keep. The Shah sought to dismantle this feudal system, redistributing land to the peasants and creating a class of small landowners who would, in theory, be loyal to the crown and invested in the stability of the regime. It was a bold vision, and in some respects, it succeeded. Millions of acres were redistributed. Hundreds of thousands of families received plots of land they could call their own. For many, it was the first time in generations that they owned anything at all. But the execution was flawed, tangled in bureaucracy and corruption. The land given to peasants was often poor, unsuitable for sustained agriculture without significant investment in irrigation and infrastructure that never materialized. The support systems needed to help these new landowners succeed, access to credit, training in modern farming techniques, markets for their produce, were inadequate or non-existent. Many former sharecroppers found themselves no better off than before, struggling to make a living on parcels too small or too barren to sustain their families. And the large landowners, stripped of their estates, became a class of disaffected elites, resentful of the Shah and eager for revenge. The religious establishment, too, was alarmed by the land reform. Many of the country's most powerful clerics derived their income from religious endowments tied to large estates. When those estates were broken up and redistributed, the economic foundation of the clergy was threatened. The clerics saw the White Revolution not as progress but as an assault on their autonomy, their influence, their very existence. And they began to speak out, carefully at first, then with growing boldness, warning that the Shah's reforms were leading Iran away from Islam, toward a godless, westernized future that would destroy the nation's soul. Among those voices was a cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini. He was not yet a household name, not yet the figure who would one day command the devotion of millions. But he was gaining prominence, known for his uncompromising stance, his fiery rhetoric, his refusal to bend to the Shah's will. In June 1963, during the holy month of Muharram, Khomeini delivered a sermon that directly attacked the Shah, accusing him of subservience to America and Israel, of betraying Islam, of acting as a puppet for foreign powers. The speech was incendiary, and the Shah's response was swift. Khomeini was arrested, sparking protests across the country. The demonstrations were met with brutal force. Troops opened fire on crowds in Tehran, Qom, and other cities. Hundreds were killed, perhaps more, the true number was never revealed. The uprising was crushed, and Khomeini was eventually exiled, first to Turkey, then to Iraq, where he would remain for years, a thorn in the Shah's side, a symbol of resistance that refused to disappear. But the Shah, confident in his strength, dismissed the protests as the last gasp of a dying order. He believed that modernization was irreversible, that once the people tasted progress, they would never turn back. He pressed forward with the other elements of the White Revolution, granting women the right to vote and to run for office, a move that shocked conservative elements of society but delighted the urban, educated classes. Women entered universities in greater numbers, joined the workforce, became doctors, lawyers, engineers. The Literacy Corps sent young educated Iranians into remote villages to teach reading and writing, spreading knowledge to corners of the country that had been neglected for generations. Factories opened. Infrastructure expanded. The economy grew at a pace that astonished international observers. And yet, beneath all this progress, there was an infrastructure of fear, a machinery of repression that ensured the Shah's vision would not be questioned, let alone opposed. That machinery had a name, and it cast a shadow over every aspect of Iranian life. It was SAVAK, and it was watching. SAVAK was not merely an intelligence agency. It was the embodiment of the Shah's paranoia, his determination to never again be vulnerable as he had been in 1953. Established in 1957 with the assistance of the CIA and Israel's Mossad, SAVAK, the Sazmani Edalat Va Amniyat-e Keshvar, or Organization of National Security and Intelligence, grew into one of the most feared security apparatuses in the world. Its mandate was broad, almost limitless, to protect the regime from internal and external threats, to monitor dissent, to eliminate opposition before it could take root. And it pursued that mandate with ruthless efficiency. SAVAK agents were everywhere, or so it seemed. They infiltrated universities, posing as students to identify and report on anyone expressing anti-regime sentiments. They embedded themselves in workplaces, in social clubs, in religious gatherings. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Friends informed on friends. The pervasive atmosphere of surveillance created a culture of silence, where speaking one's mind, even in private, carried the risk of arrest, torture, or worse. People learned to self-censor, to watch their words, to trust no one. Iran became a nation where the walls had ears, and the cost of dissent was measured in years of imprisonment or broken bodies. The methods employed by SAVAK were designed not just to punish but to terrorize. Suspects were arrested without warning, often in the middle of the night, taken to secret detention centers where they disappeared into a bureaucratic void. Families were not informed. Lawyers were not provided. The detainees simply vanished, and their loved ones could only wait and hope and fear. Inside those detention centers, interrogation was an art form of cruelty. Electric shocks. Sleep deprivation. Beatings. Psychological torment that broke the spirit as thoroughly as physical pain broke the body. The goal was confession, compliance, the extraction of information and the destruction of will. Some prisoners emerged shattered, their minds fractured, their lives ruined. Others did not emerge at all. The Shah knew what SAVAK was doing. He approved of it. In his mind, the stability of Iran, the success of his modernization program, required absolute control. Dissent was not merely disagreement, it was treason, a threat to the nation's progress, a doorway through which chaos and communism might enter. He justified SAVAK's brutality as necessary, a regrettable but unavoidable cost of maintaining order in a volatile region surrounded by enemies. And for a time, the strategy worked. Opposition was driven underground. The few political parties that were allowed to exist were tame, controlled, little more than vehicles for the Shah's policies. The press printed what it was told to print. The universities, though filled with bright young minds, learned to keep their thoughts within safe boundaries. But fear, as effective as it is, cannot entirely suppress the human hunger for freedom. It can drive resistance into the shadows, but it cannot kill it. And in those shadows, away from SAVAK's all-seeing eyes, the seeds of opposition continued to grow. Intellectuals circulated banned books in secret, passing samizdat copies of forbidden texts that questioned the Shah's legitimacy, critiqued his dependence on America, imagined a different future for Iran. Leftist groups, inspired by Marxist ideology and the revolutionary movements sweeping through the Third World, organized clandestinely, preparing for armed struggle. And in the mosques, where SAVAK's reach was less certain, clerics continued to preach, their sermons coded but clear to those who listened carefully. The Shah's revolution was not their revolution. His modernity was not their vision. And they would wait for the moment when the people were ready to hear them. Meanwhile, the Shah himself grew more grandiose, more convinced of his own indispensability. The oil revenues, which had been substantial in the 1960s, exploded in the 1970s following the OPEC oil embargo and the resulting price increases. Suddenly, Iran was awash in wealth beyond imagination. The Shah's budget swelled, and he spent it with abandon. Billions went to the military, purchasing the most advanced American weapons, F-14 fighter jets, helicopters, tanks, missiles. Iran's armed forces became the most powerful in the region, a point of immense pride for the Shah, who saw himself not just as a king but as a guardian of stability in the Persian Gulf. He envisioned Iran as a regional superpower, the policeman that would keep the peace, protect Western interests, and ensure the flow of oil to the industrialized world. But the wealth was not evenly distributed. The gap between the rich and the poor widened into a chasm. In North Tehran, the affluent neighborhoods gleamed with modern villas, luxury cars, and European fashions. The elite lived lives of extravagant comfort, sending their children to study abroad, vacationing in Paris and London, adopting Western lifestyles with enthusiasm. But in South Tehran, in the sprawling slums that ringed the city, millions lived in poverty, crammed into makeshift housing, struggling to survive on meager wages. The rural poor, many of whom had been promised a better life through land reform, found themselves adrift, migrating to cities in search of work that often did not exist. They became an underclass, resentful and desperate, watching the wealth of the nation flow past them like a river they could never touch. The Shah seemed blind to this growing discontent, or perhaps he simply did not care. He surrounded himself with sycophants, advisors who told him what he wanted to hear, who praised his vision and dismissed any criticism as the work of foreign agitators or misguided reactionaries. He became increasingly isolated, insulated from the reality of his own country by layers of bureaucracy and the protective bubble of the palace. He gave lavish parties, hosted foreign dignitaries, spoke of Iran's glorious future as if it were already assured. In 1971, he staged an extravagant celebration at Persepolis, the ancient ruins of the Persian Empire, to commemorate the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the monarchy. The event was a spectacle of unimaginable excess, tents imported from France, champagne and caviar flown in from Europe, guests from around the world treated to a display of wealth and power that was meant to demonstrate Iran's arrival on the world stage. But to many Iranians, the celebration at Persepolis was an obscenity, a grotesque display of vanity and waste while so many of the Shah's subjects struggled to feed their families. The contrast between the opulence of the palace and the poverty of the streets became impossible to ignore. And the resentment, carefully suppressed by SAVAK's omnipresent threat, began to harden into something more dangerous, a quiet, simmering rage that waited only for a spark to ignite it. The Shah had built a glittering facade of modernity and progress, but it was hollow, resting on a foundation of fear and inequality. And the people, watching from the shadows, were beginning to understand that no amount of oil wealth, no amount of military might, could hold together a nation whose soul had been sold to foreign powers and whose spirit had been crushed by the machinery of repression. The White Revolution had promised transformation, but it had delivered only illusion. And illusions, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot withstand the weight of truth forever. The 1970s were years of contradictions, a decade when Iran seemed to shine with unprecedented brilliance while rot spread quietly beneath the surface. To the outside world, the Shah's Iran was a success story, a model of what authoritarian modernization could achieve. The economy grew at staggering rates, fueled by oil revenues that seemed limitless. Tehran transformed into a bustling metropolis, its skyline punctuated by glass towers and modern architecture. The universities produced engineers, doctors, and scientists. Women walked the streets in miniskirts and heels, a visible symbol of the Shah's commitment to westernization. Foreign dignitaries visited the palace and marveled at the progress, at the vision of a king who seemed to have dragged his nation from the medieval past into the gleaming present. But those who looked more closely, who ventured beyond the polished facade of North Tehran and the carefully curated tours given to foreign journalists, saw a different picture. They saw corruption that permeated every level of government, where contracts were awarded not on merit but on bribes, where officials enriched themselves while public services languished. They saw an economy distorted by oil, where wealth pooled in the hands of a small elite while inflation ravaged the middle class and the poor. The cost of living soared. Housing became unaffordable. The gap between promise and reality grew wider with each passing year, and the people who had been told to be patient, to wait for the benefits of modernization to trickle down, began to realize they had been sold a lie. The Shah's relationship with the United States, once a source of strength, became a source of shame. Iran's military spending reached absurd levels, with billions of dollars spent on American weapons that were often too sophisticated for Iranian personnel to operate effectively. The American presence in Iran grew more visible, more intrusive. Thousands of American military advisors and technicians lived in Iran, often in compounds that resembled miniature versions of suburban America, isolated from the Iranian society around them. They enjoyed privileges that ordinary Iranians could only dream of, and their presence was a constant reminder of the Shah's dependence on foreign support. The clerics, the nationalists, the leftists, they all pointed to the Americans as proof that Iran was not truly sovereign, that the Shah was nothing more than a puppet dancing on strings pulled from Washington. And then there was the issue of human rights, a topic that the Shah dismissed as Western hypocrisy but that increasingly drew international attention. Amnesty International and other organizations documented SAVAK's abuses, publishing reports that detailed torture, arbitrary detention, and the suppression of political freedoms. The Shah's response was defiant. He argued that Iran needed stability, that democracy was a luxury his country could not afford, that the critics did not understand the threats he faced from communists and religious extremists. He pointed to the progress he had made, the schools, the hospitals, the infrastructure, and demanded to know why the West focused on a few dissenters rather than celebrating the transformation of an entire nation. But the world was changing. The 1970s were a time of growing awareness about authoritarianism, of movements for human rights and social justice that crossed borders and challenged established powers. The Shah, who had once been celebrated as a staunch ally against communism, now found himself increasingly criticized, even by his American patrons. When Jimmy Carter became President of the United States in 1977, the tone shifted. Carter, who had campaigned on a platform of human rights and moral leadership, was uncomfortable with the excesses of the Shah's regime. He pressed the Shah to ease the repression, to allow more political freedom, to address the grievances of his people. The Shah, unaccustomed to such pressure from his most important ally, was offended and confused. He had been loyal to America for decades, had spent billions on American weapons, had positioned Iran as the guardian of Western interests in the Persian Gulf. And now he was being lectured on human rights by a president who seemed not to understand the realities of governing a volatile region. The Shah made some gestures toward reform, releasing a few political prisoners, allowing slightly more freedom for the press. But the changes were superficial, reluctant, and came too late. The pressure had built for too long. The resentment had deepened too far. And the people, after decades of silence enforced by fear, were beginning to find their voice. It started slowly, cautiously, with small protests and gatherings that tested the limits of what SAVAK would tolerate. Intellectuals published open letters calling for political reforms. Students held demonstrations on university campuses. Workers organized strikes, demanding better wages and working conditions. Each action, each small act of defiance, emboldened others. The fear that had paralyzed Iranian society for so long was beginning to crack. The clerics, who had been marginalized and suppressed, watched this awakening with keen interest. They had never fully accepted the Shah's legitimacy, never reconciled themselves to his westernization project, never forgiven the coup that had destroyed Mossadegh and with him the hope of a democratic, independent Iran. And they still had Khomeini, exiled but not forgotten, his voice reaching Iran through smuggled cassette tapes that circulated in the bazaars and the mosques. Khomeini's message was clear and uncompromising. The Shah was illegitimate, a tyrant propped up by foreign powers. His modernization was a corruption of Islamic values. His rule was an affront to God. And the only solution was revolution, a complete overthrow of the regime and the establishment of an Islamic government that would restore Iran's dignity and independence. For years, Khomeini's words had been dismissed by the Shah and his advisors as the ramblings of a bitter old man, irrelevant and powerless. But those cassette tapes found an audience, particularly among the poor, the dispossessed, the millions who had been left behind by the Shah's glittering vision of progress. They heard in Khomeini's voice something the Shah had never offered them, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of moral clarity in a world that felt increasingly corrupt and unjust. They heard a promise that their suffering had meaning, that their faith mattered, that a better future was possible if they were willing to fight for it. The Shah, surrounded by advisors who told him only what he wanted to hear, did not see the storm gathering. He believed that his military was loyal, that his people were content, that his alliance with America would protect him from any serious threat. He continued to live in opulence, to throw parties, to speak of Iran's destiny as a great power. He was building a new imperial complex in Tehran, planning celebrations, looking forward to a future that he was certain would vindicate all his choices, all his sacrifices, all the compromises he had made in the name of progress. But the future, as it turned out, had very different plans. And the revolution, when it came, would not be white. It would be red and green and black, the colors of blood and Islam and mourning. And it would sweep away everything the Shah had built, leaving nothing behind but ruins and regret. The end began not with a thunderclap but with a whisper, a small incident in a provincial city that would grow into a conflagration no one could control. On January 7, 1978, a government-controlled newspaper published an article attacking Ayatollah Khomeini, calling him a British agent, a reactionary, an enemy of progress. It was meant to discredit him, to turn public opinion against the exiled cleric who had become an increasingly vocal critic of the regime. But the article had the opposite effect. In the holy city of Qom, seminary students and clerics took to the streets in protest, outraged by the insult to their revered leader. The demonstrations were peaceful at first, chanting slogans, demanding an apology. But the police, accustomed to crushing dissent, responded with violence. They opened fire on the crowd. Several protesters were killed, their blood staining the streets of a city that had always been a center of religious learning and devotion. In Shia Islam, there is a tradition of mourning the dead 40 days after their passing. On the 40th day after the killings in Qom, memorial services were held across the country. Those services turned into protests. And those protests turned violent. More people were killed. And 40 days later, the cycle repeated. Each round of mourning became a new opportunity for demonstration, each demonstration a new confrontation with the security forces, each confrontation producing new martyrs whose deaths would be mourned 40 days hence. It was a rhythm of escalation, a drumbeat of revolution that grew louder with each passing week. The Shah and his advisors watched with growing alarm, unsure how to break the cycle without making things worse. The protests spread beyond the religious establishment. Students joined, demanding political freedoms and an end to SAVAK's repression. Workers organized strikes, shutting down factories and oil refineries. The Bazaris, the traditional merchant class who had long been a conservative force in Iranian society, closed their shops in solidarity with the demonstrators. They resented the Shah's economic policies, which favored large corporations and foreign investors over small businesses. They resented the corruption, the inflation, the sense that the country was being sold to the highest bidder. And they had deep ties to the clerical establishment, ties that went back generations, bonds of family and faith and mutual interest. When the clerics called for resistance, the Bazaris answered. By the summer of 1978, the protests had become a daily occurrence in cities across Iran. Tehran streets filled with demonstrators chanting "Death to the Shah" and "Long live Khomeini." The slogans were bold, unthinkable just months earlier, but the fear that had kept people silent was dissolving. There was power in numbers, in the collective voice of thousands, tens of thousands, eventually millions. The government responded with curfews, with mass arrests, with military force. But every crackdown only fueled the anger, adding more martyrs to the growing list, more reasons to resist. The Shah, for the first time in his long reign, seemed uncertain. He had always believed that his military would protect him, that the people, for all their grumbling, would never truly rise against him. But now he was facing something he had not anticipated, a movement that was not led by politicians or intellectuals, not organized by leftist guerrillas or foreign agitators, but by the clerics and the masses they commanded. It was a revolution rooted in faith, in grievance, in a rejection of everything the Shah represented. And he did not know how to stop it. He tried gestures of appeasement. He dismissed his prime minister and appointed a new one, a man who promised reforms and reconciliation. He gave speeches pledging to listen to the people's concerns, to address corruption, to restore justice. He released political prisoners, eased press restrictions, allowed more freedom of expression. But these concessions, far from calming the situation, were seen as signs of weakness. The protesters sensed that the Shah was vulnerable, that he was losing his grip, and they pressed harder. The chants grew louder. The demands became more radical. It was no longer enough to reform the monarchy. Now, the cry was for its abolition, for the overthrow of the entire system, for a new Iran free from the Shah and his foreign masters. In exile, Khomeini watched the unfolding chaos with satisfaction. He issued statements, recorded on cassette tapes and smuggled into Iran, calling for continued resistance, urging the people not to be fooled by the Shah's promises. He declared that any compromise with the regime was unacceptable, that the only solution was the complete removal of the monarchy and the establishment of an Islamic republic. His words resonated, not just with the religious faithful but with a broad spectrum of Iranians who saw in him a symbol of defiance, of uncompromising opposition to tyranny. Khomeini became the face of the revolution, the leader in absentia, the man whose name was chanted in the streets even though he had not set foot in Iran for 15 years. On September 8, 1978, the revolution reached a turning point. The government had declared martial law, banning all demonstrations and giving the military authority to use force to restore order. But in Tehran, thousands of people gathered in Jaleh Square, defying the ban, daring the soldiers to stop them. The military, following orders from the Shah, opened fire. The massacre lasted for hours. Hundreds were killed, perhaps more, their bodies left in the square as a brutal warning to anyone who dared to continue the resistance. The day became known as Black Friday, and it shattered whatever remained of the Shah's legitimacy. He had shown that he was willing to kill his own people to hold on to power. And the people, in turn, vowed that they would never stop until he was gone. The revolution entered its final phase. The momentum was unstoppable now, a wave that no amount of military force could contain. And the Shah, standing alone in his palace, surrounded by advisors who no longer believed in victory, began to understand that his reign was coming to an end. The dream of a modern, powerful Iran, built on his vision and sustained by American support, was collapsing. And there was nothing he could do to save it. The final months of 1978 unfolded like a slow-motion collapse, each day bringing fresh evidence that the Shah's grip on power was slipping beyond recovery. The oil workers, the backbone of Iran's economy, went on strike in October, bringing production to a halt and cutting off the revenue that had funded the Shah's grand ambitions. The pumps fell silent. The refineries cooled. The wealth that had poured into Iran for decades, enriching the palace and arming the military, suddenly dried up. Without oil, the economy began to seize. Fuel shortages paralyzed the country. Electricity became sporadic. The government, hemorrhaging money and authority, struggled to maintain even basic services. The strike spread to other sectors. Teachers walked out of classrooms. Government employees refused to show up for work. Even the workers in the central bank abandoned their posts, leaving the financial system in chaos. The bazaars remained closed, their shutters pulled down in a silent but powerful act of defiance. Tehran, once a city that hummed with commerce and ambition, became a ghost town punctuated by protests and military checkpoints. The normal rhythms of life had been replaced by the rhythms of revolution, demonstrations during the day, curfews at night, the constant uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring. The Shah tried everything. He replaced his government again, this time appointing a military officer as prime minister, hoping that a show of strength would restore order. But the military government only hardened the resolve of the opposition. Tanks in the streets, soldiers on every corner, these were not symbols of stability but of desperation, proof that the regime had lost the consent of the governed and could rule only through force. And force, the Shah was discovering, had its limits. The soldiers, mostly young men conscripted from ordinary families, were increasingly reluctant to fire on their own people. Some units refused orders. Others simply melted away, deserting their posts, joining the protests, or returning to their homes and families. The Americans, watching from afar, were paralyzed by indecision. President Carter and his advisors debated endlessly about what to do. Should they support the Shah with military intervention, risking a backlash that could radicalize the entire Middle East? Should they encourage him to step down and negotiate a transition, hoping to preserve some influence in whatever government came next? Or should they simply abandon him, cutting their losses and accepting that Iran was lost? The internal divisions within the Carter administration mirrored the chaos in Iran itself. No one knew what the right move was, and by the time they might have figured it out, it was already too late. The revolution had its own momentum, and it was not waiting for American permission to proceed. The Shah, meanwhile, was falling apart. He had been diagnosed with cancer years earlier, a secret he had kept from almost everyone, even his closest advisors. The disease was progressing, sapping his strength, clouding his judgment. He was undergoing treatment, but the medication left him tired, depressed, unable to think clearly. The man who had once ruled with such confidence, who had believed himself indispensable to Iran's future, now spent his days in the palace, withdrawn and despondent, watching his world crumble on television. He gave interviews to foreign journalists, trying to explain himself, to justify his actions, to plead for understanding. But his words sounded hollow, the protests of a man who no longer believed his own narrative. On December 10 and 11, 1978, the revolution reached a crescendo. Millions of people poured into the streets of Tehran and other cities in what became known as the Day of Ashura demonstrations, named for the Shia holy day commemorating the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. The crowds were massive, unprecedented in Iranian history, stretching as far as the eye could see. They marched peacefully, but their message was clear and unequivocal: the Shah must go. They carried banners with Khomeini's image, chanted his name, demanded the establishment of an Islamic republic. The military, faced with crowds of this size, did not even attempt to intervene. To fire on millions would have been a massacre beyond comprehension, and the soldiers knew it. They stood aside and let the people march. The Shah watched the footage and knew it was over. He could not fight a revolution of this magnitude. He could not rely on an army that was unwilling to kill on such a scale. He could not depend on American support that was hesitant and conditional. And he could not continue to rule a country that rejected him so completely. In early January 1979, he made the decision to leave. He called it a vacation, a temporary absence to allow tensions to cool. But everyone knew the truth. The Shah was fleeing, abandoning the throne he had fought so hard to keep, leaving Iran in the hands of forces he could not control. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi boarded a plane at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. He was accompanied by his wife, Empress Farah, and a small entourage. There were no crowds to see him off, no ceremonies, no tearful farewells. Just a quiet departure, a king slipping away into exile. As the plane lifted off, the Shah looked down at the city he had ruled for nearly 4 decades, the city he had tried to transform into a symbol of modernity and power. And then he turned away, and the plane carried him into the unknown, toward a future of uncertainty and regret. He would never return. He traveled first to Egypt, where President Anwar Sadat, one of the few leaders still loyal to him, offered him refuge. But the Shah's health was deteriorating, and he needed medical treatment that Egypt could not provide. He sought entry to the United States, but the Carter administration, wary of inflaming the situation in Iran, refused to grant him a visa. He wandered from country to country, Morocco, the Bahamas, Mexico, a king without a kingdom, a man whose vast wealth could not buy him a home or peace of mind. Eventually, under pressure from influential Americans who argued that abandoning a longtime ally was morally indefensible, Carter allowed the Shah to enter the United States for medical treatment. It was a decision that would have catastrophic consequences, triggering the hostage crisis that would define Carter's presidency and poison relations between Iran and America for generations. But in January 1979, as the Shah's plane disappeared into the sky, the Iranian people erupted in celebration. They poured into the streets, dancing, cheering, honking car horns, embracing strangers. The tyrant was gone. The dictator had fled. After decades of repression, of fear, of living under the weight of a regime that denied them their voice and their dignity, they were free. The jubilation was genuine, overwhelming, a release of emotion that had been bottled up for far too long. They believed, in that moment, that anything was possible, that a new Iran was about to be born, an Iran that would belong to them, not to foreign powers or autocratic kings. They did not yet know what form that new Iran would take. They did not yet understand that the revolution, having devoured the Shah, would soon turn on itself, consuming the very freedoms it had promised. They did not yet see the shadow of Khomeini, waiting in exile, preparing to return and shape the future in his own image. But for now, in the exhilaration of victory, they celebrated. The Peacock throne was empty. The dynasty was over. And the future, uncertain and unwritten, stretched out before them like a blank page waiting to be filled. 2 weeks after the Shah's departure, on February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran. He had been in exile for 15 years, first in Turkey, then in Iraq, and finally in France, from where he had orchestrated the final stages of the revolution through recorded messages and interviews with international media. Now, at the age of 76, he was coming home, not as a defeated exile but as the undisputed leader of a victorious movement. The plane that carried him from Paris to Tehran was filled with journalists and supporters, all of them aware that they were witnessing a historic moment. When a reporter asked Khomeini how he felt about returning to Iran after so long, he answered with a single word, delivered in a flat, emotionless tone, nothing. It was a response that captured something essential about the man, his austere detachment, his focus not on personal sentiment but on the mission ahead. The scene at the airport was pandemonium. Millions of people lined the streets from Mehrabad Airport to the Beheshti Zahra Cemetery, where Khomeini would deliver his first speech on Iranian soil. They climbed onto rooftops, hung from lampposts, pressed against barricades, all desperate for a glimpse of the man they had been forbidden to see for so long. Khomeini rode through the crowds in a simple car, his expression stern, his hand occasionally raised in acknowledgement but never in triumph. He did not smile. He did not wave enthusiastically. He was not there to bask in adulation. He was there to lead, to transform, to remake Iran according to his vision of Islamic government. At the cemetery, standing before the graves of those who had been killed during the revolution, Khomeini addressed the masses. His voice was calm, deliberate, uncompromising. He declared that the Shah's government was illegal, that any officials still serving under the remnants of the old regime were traitors. He announced the formation of a provisional government under his authority, bypassing the secular politicians and liberal intellectuals who had hoped to shape the post-revolutionary order. He spoke of justice, of independence, of a return to Islamic values. And the crowd, millions strong, roared their approval. They had made this revolution, and now they were handing it to him, trusting that he would deliver the Iran they had fought for. But the revolution Khomeini envisioned was not the revolution that many of his supporters had imagined. The coalition that had overthrown the Shah was broad and diverse: leftists who dreamed of socialism, liberals who wanted democracy, nationalists who sought independence from foreign influence, and the religious faithful who desired a government rooted in Islam. For a brief moment, they had all marched together, united by their opposition to the Shah. But now that the common enemy was gone, the fractures began to appear. What kind of Iran would replace the monarchy? Who would hold power? What role would religion play in the new state? Khomeini had an answer, and it was not one that left room for compromise. He believed in the concept of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, a system in which the clergy, and specifically the supreme religious leader, would hold ultimate authority over the government. It was a vision of theocracy, where Islamic law would be the foundation of all legislation, where the clerics would have the final say on matters of state, where secular politicians would be subordinate to religious authority. It was a radical idea, one that many Iranians, even devout Muslims, had not anticipated. But Khomeini was persuasive, charismatic in his own austere way, and he had the support of the masses who saw him as the embodiment of their struggle. A referendum was held in March 1979, asking Iranians to vote on whether they wanted an Islamic republic. The results were overwhelming: more than 98% voted yes. But the referendum was vague, offering no details about what an Islamic republic would actually look like, no clarity on how power would be distributed, no guarantees of rights or freedoms. People voted for it because they trusted Khomeini, because they believed in the promise of independence and justice, because they were swept up in the euphoria of revolution. They did not realize, could not have realized, that they were voting for a system that would soon become as repressive as the one they had just overthrown. The provisional government, led by moderate politicians like Mehdi Bazargan, tried to navigate between the demands of the clerics and the hopes of the secular reformers. But they were outmaneuvered at every turn. Revolutionary committees sprang up across the country, enforcing Islamic law, arresting former officials of the Shah's regime, purging the military and the civil service of anyone deemed insufficiently loyal to the new order. These committees answered not to the government but to Khomeini and the clerics, creating a parallel power structure that wielded more real authority than the formal institutions of the state. Former officials, military officers, and members of SAVAK were rounded up and subjected to hastily organized trials that bore little resemblance to justice. The accused were given no real opportunity to defend themselves, no access to lawyers, no presumption of innocence. Many were executed, shot by firing squad in the courtyards of prisons, their deaths announced on the radio as necessary acts of revolutionary justice. The very people who had once tortured and imprisoned dissenters now found themselves on the receiving end of the same brutality, condemned by a system that mirrored the one they had served. The cycle of violence continued, dressed in new rhetoric but unchanged in its essence. The leftists and liberals who had supported the revolution began to voice concerns. They had not fought to replace one dictatorship with another, they argued. They had wanted freedom, democracy, a government accountable to the people. But Khomeini dismissed these concerns as naive, as the complaints of those who did not understand the true nature of Islam or the dangers still facing the revolution. He consolidated power methodically, creating the Revolutionary Guards, a military force loyal to him personally, independent of the regular army. He established the Council of Guardians, a body of clerics who would vet all legislation to ensure it conformed to Islamic law. Step by step, He built the architecture of a theocratic state, and by the time the liberals and leftists realized what was happening, it was too late to stop it. In November 1979, the revolution took a turn that would isolate Iran from the West for decades. A group of radical students, angered by President Carter's decision to allow the Shah into the United States for medical treatment, stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. They demanded the extradition of the Shah to stand trial in Iran. Khomeini, initially ambivalent, soon endorsed the takeover, seeing it as a powerful symbol of Iran's break with America, that great Satan that had propped up the Shah and exploited Iran for so long. The hostage crisis dragged on for 444 days, dominating headlines around the world, humiliating the United States, and cementing the enmity between the two nations. The Shah, meanwhile, continued his lonely exile. He left the United States after a few months, his health worsening, his presence too politically toxic for Carter to bear. He returned to Egypt, where Anwar Sadat, alone among world leaders, still offered him sanctuary. On July 27, 1980, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi died in a hospital in Cairo. He was 60 years old. His funeral was a small, quiet affair, attended by a handful of dignitaries and exiled Iranian monarchists. There were no grand ceremonies, no outpouring of grief, no recognition of the man who had once ruled one of the world's most powerful nations. He was buried in a mosque in Cairo, far from the land he had loved and lost, far from the throne he had believed was his destiny. In Iran, his death was barely noted. The revolution had moved on, consumed by its own internal struggles, its wars with Iraq, its efforts to export Islamic revolution to the rest of the Middle East. The Pahlavi Dynasty, which had promised to make Iran modern and powerful, was consigned to history, remembered by some with nostalgia, by others with bitterness, by most with a mixture of both. The Shah had transformed Iran, there was no denying that. He had built roads and schools, hospitals and universities. He had expanded women's rights, modernized the economy, created a middle class. But he had done it all through force, through dependence on foreign powers, through the suppression of dissent and the denial of freedom. And in the end, the people chose faith over modernity, independence over alliance, revolution over reform. The story of the Pahlavi dynasty is a story of ambition and tragedy, of a father who seized power through strength and a son who lost it through weakness, of a nation caught between the demands of tradition and the allure of progress. It is a story of foreign intervention, of coups and conspiracies, of oil and empire and the price that nations pay when their fate is decided not by their own people but by the calculations of distant powers. And it is a story that still echoes today, in the tensions between Iran and the West, in the suspicions and resentments that shape Middle Eastern politics, in the memory of a time when democracy was sacrificed for stability and the consequences reverberated for generations. As the night deepens and these words settle into the quiet, remember this: history is not made by kings alone, nor by revolutions, nor by the grand designs of empires. It is made by the choices of ordinary people, by the moments when they decide they can no longer remain silent, when they rise and demand to be heard. The Pahlavi dynasty rose on the promise of strength and fell when that strength revealed itself as hollow. And Iran, forever changed, turned its back on the crown and walked into an uncertain future, carrying with it the scars of all that had come before. The throne is empty now. The peacock has flown. And the echoes of its reign fade slowly into the silence of memory.